Study 8, A Nation Divided.
In our study today, we're going to be beginning in that magic time in Israel's history, its golden age, which was the days of David and Solomon. Those were the best of times, and if you had a choice to live anywhere in the Old Testament, that's the time you would want to pick, the days of David and Solomon. After David had been used by the Lord to really neutralize all of the enemies around Israel, a wonderful peace descended upon the nation. When David was out doing his battles, I believe that as he conquered various cities of these foreigners, he observed something, and that is that the temples to their gods were very extravagant. In fact, this is probably continues to be true today, that people, when it comes to their religious systems, will have ornate and beautiful and oftentimes extravagant temples where they focus on the worship of their God. Well, David had observed this in these various places. And then when he came back to his own land, what did he see? He saw this tacky tabernacle. Remember, it's made out of animal skins and cloth, and by this time, it's about 450 years old. Now, I'm sure they must have replaced a few items here and there, but you know, with your Coleman tents, after 10, 15 years of use, they don't look quite like they came out of the box. And I think David came back, and one of the things that impressed him was the fact that, you know what? We serve the King of Kings, the God of the universe. And look at this tacky, shabby little place that we have for him. And David was determined, we're changing this. We are going to build a great temple to our God. And so David had a buddy, a prophet, by the name of Nathan. And David said to his buddy, the prophet Nathan, I want to build a magnificent, glorious, fantastic, extravagant temple to the Lord our God. Nathan listens to him and says, great idea. Go to it. But then God spoke to Nathan and said, I appreciate the offer, but David is a man of war. He has shed blood everywhere, and it is inappropriate that he should build such a temple to me. His son can, but he cannot. And so when David made the request to build a house for God, that is going to bring about this great Davidic covenant, because in essence, what God is going to say to David is, you can't build me a house, but I'm going to build you a house. And what he meant by that is really a dynasty. And so we enter into what is known as the Davidic Covenant. And there are essentially 5 parts to this covenant. And they are mentioned again and again in Scripture. And in the right-hand side, we have some of these references, and there are really many, 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 many more besides that. But there are 5 basic elements to this Davidic covenant. The first would be David would be famous. He would be well known. And that was fulfilled in David's lifetime. David was well known. And even today, a lot of people know about King David. And so God did give him that kind of positive notoriety. Secondly, God said, I'm going to give you rest from your enemies. And really what David had done during the decades of his rule is he had neutralized the powers all around Israel. That's why they were living in peace. And then God said, I'm going to give you a house, a throne, and a kingdom. Well, when he talks about a house, he's not talking about a 4-bedroom, 3-bath ranch. He is talking about a dynasty. And so a house is a ruling dynasty. And this is huge, absolutely huge. What God is saying here to David, as long as there is a throne in Israel, a descendant of yours is going to sit upon that throne. One of the things that scared monarchs to death was the fact that they're going to be killed and their family is going to be killed. It happens in the Old Testament, even in the northern kingdom, that if you have a coup where you're going to overthrow the king, you know what you do, don't you? You assassinate the king. But you don't stop there. He's got wives, you get rid of them. He's got sons, you kill them. You've got daughters, you kill them. You have close friends and cousins, you kill them. Anybody that could possibly challenge this newcomer is eliminated. These are bloodbaths that took place, and it happened all over the Middle East at that time in these ancient days. And so when God says to David, you will always have a descendant sitting upon the throne, that is incredible. That is an incredible promise that he gives. And so, while the monarchy will in fact come to an end in the year 586 BC, and the monarchy has never returned to Israel, so it's been obviously over 2.5 millennia since this has happened, the Scriptures point out, particularly when we get to the New Testament, that Jesus of Nazareth, son of Mary, is the son of David, and he qualifies and he will rule. There is a messianic age that is coming. He has also promised a throne, and a throne has to do with the idea of ruling authority. And he has also promised a kingdom. You see, you could have ruling authority. We've heard of the king of Afghanistan. They used to have one, and he's living in Paris. But he doesn't have a kingdom, not really. But David's descendants are promised not just ruling authority, not just a position, but an actual kingdom itself. And so this is a marvelous thing, but it flows out of God being offered a house for David to build for him, a temple. And God says, appreciate the offer. You are a man of blood. It's not appropriate that when you have so much blood on your hands that you would build a temple to a holy God, but you can, in fact, prepare for the temple. But your son is the one who is going to build it. Instead, I'm going to make a covenant with you. And this, of course, develops from the Abrahamic covenant those key ingredients of a seed, a descendant and king coming from Abraham. Now you see what's happened is it goes from Abraham and the 12 tribes down to the tribe of Judah, but more specifically now to one family, that is the line of David. So this is a huge thing. I don't think David in his lifetime really ever got over what in fact God did for him. So we come now to the transition from David to Solomon. And we're not going to take time to go into it and the details of it. For whatever reasons, we're not sure, David never made it public who the next king would be. Now, privately, he had told folks, the next king is going to be my son Solomon. So as David is getting older, he died at the age of 70. As he is getting older, the last year or so of his life, his sons are beginning to jockey for power to see who can become king. And you kind of wonder, David, hey man, step in, make it clear. But he doesn't until the last minute when one of his sons is throwing a coronation party for himself. At that point, we better make it clear who the next king is. Oh, by the way, that's going to be Solomon. And so David finally says Solomon is king. And then you have David giving his son some advice. And his advice basically says, look, son, you be a man of the book, okay? You follow God's commandments. You do things God's way, and you will be prospering in your life and in your reign as king. Oh, and on a practical note, there's a couple guys you should get rid of. They are bad news. And he goes in to explain who these guys are, that if you do not get rid of these guys, they're going to be a problem for you in your reign as king. So Solomon, David dies quietly, and Solomon now becomes the next king. And the following chapters in 1 King just tell us of the incredible start that this man had. Solomon was approached by God himself. There would be two visions of God, appearances of God to Solomon. In the first one, and I don't know if this is the story of genies in the bottle come from. You know, you rub the bottle, the genie pops out and says, what would you, 3 wishes? Because God comes to him and says, what would you like? I'll give you anything you want. And Solomon answered, you know, I need wisdom. I'm to govern millions of people, and I'm basically a kid. I need some help. And God says, good choice. I'm going to give you wisdom. But you know, you didn't ask for great power, great wealth. But you know what? I'm going to give those to you too. And so, again, if you would like to pick a time to live in the national life of Israel, this is the time. This is going to be the most prosperous time of any king's reign. It's a time of peace. It's the golden age of literature in Israel, when art and literature is being produced. This is just the best of times. There's prosperity for everyone in this kingdom. And Solomon was a builder. Some of you know, who have gone to Israel, that even today we find remnants of the buildings of Solomon. We find his horse stables at Megiddo. We find his pools in Jerusalem. Things that Solomon, he was a builder. He built everywhere. It was amazing what he built. So these are very prosperous times. Everybody had a job, you see, and everybody's working, and it was just a great time. Well, the greatest building project of Solomon would be, in fact, the temple. And David tells Solomon, before David's death, of course, that there are certain preparations that have been done. And Solomon is to build this temple. Now, if you have your Bibles, turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 22. Remember, we said that Chronicles now picks up and the details, the things related to the temple and the priesthood and to the godly kings. So initially, in chapter 22, where should we build a temple? I mean, aside from Mount Zion, which is packed, you're not sticking anything there, where should we go with this thing? Well, through a series of events, there was a threshing floor just north of Mount Zion. And a threshing floor, you know, was on a place where the wind would blow and you'd winnow the grain there. And that's what it was used for. And through a series of events, David came to understand that this threshing floor on Moriah was the place where the temple was to be. And though David could not actually build the temple, what he did do was to begin to accumulate gold, silver, bronze, even iron for nails, cedar wood, marble, building stones that were precious. And we'll see the value of this building because it's given to us. But the other thing that we find that I wanted to mention is found in 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 11. Then David gave his son Solomon the plan for the porch of the temple, its buildings, its storehouses, its upper rooms. So this is more than a one-story building. Its inner rooms and the room for the mercy seat. Now, the basic pattern was going to follow the tabernacle, but this is far bigger, far more elaborate. And verse 19 is sort of an intriguing verse. All this related to the plan, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me all the details of this pattern. Where did Moses get the plans for the tabernacle? He got them directly from God, didn't he? And David is testifying to the fact that the plans for the temple came from God directly to him by writing. Now, how this all worked, I don't know, but the details, every detail was given to David by God himself. So he didn't hire some architectural firm in Jerusalem to come up with plans. God gave him the plans themselves. So 1 Chronicles 22, 28, and 29 do in fact give to us the fact that David now, while he couldn't build the temple, was now going to in fact prepare for the temple building. We took a look at this in a previous study, and to just give us some perspective in this artist's conception. The area of Mount Zion, where the Jebusites lived and which David took, was then renamed Jerusalem. And David's palace was being built there, and as many of you are aware, today in Israel, this palace has been uncovered, and they are painstakingly going through the archaeological ruins of David's palace, proving again, of course, that David was there about 1000 BC. But the issue now becomes, where do we build the temple? Now, these are natural defensive valleys around the city, but to the north, this is where that threshing floor was, right here. The problem was that it couldn't be defended. So Solomon built walls around it, and he built his own palace, which was no shabby structure, by the way. But he also built the temple. And of course, today, when you see Israel and Jerusalem, you see the golden dome of the Muslim shrine there. That's the location, the exact location of the old temple. In fact, when you see that shrine, we used to be able to go into it. They don't allow us to now. But you can go in, and in the scarp of the rock, I mean, the bedrock is right there. There is a niche there where archaeologists believe that this is where the Holy of Holies was located, right at that spot. So this is where David is going to build this temple. Now, or Solomon, is going to build this temple. Now, just of interest, because we kind of like these kinds of things, I don't know how long, if you had a house built sometime, but most of us as Americans, if we had a house built, 13 years is a long time. But hey, when you have an 11,000 square foot house, this is going to take a little while, especially when it is ornate. I don't know how big your house is or your dwelling place, but my guess is that there's very few of us here who have an 11,000 square foot house. But Solomon did. But what's of most important is not that. It is this grand temple that he builds. So, the Lord's house. David, as we mentioned from 1 Chronicles, in his last years, began to accumulate immense amounts of valuable stones, precious metals, and so on. You don't need to answer, but guess how much this temple in U.S. dollars today cost. Don't say out loud. We don't want to embarrass you. But first of all, because David gives us the number of talents, as they were called, for each one. It's always difficult to translate that into U.S. dollars, depending upon the inflation rate and all of that. But what's interesting is that in silver alone, there was about $755 million worth of silver put into that temple. I mean, they put silver on all kinds of things. But what blows my mind is the gold. Over $15 billion worth of gold. On these two items alone, this temple is over $16 billion. And it's no wonder that when David said, I am going to build a magnificent, beautiful, excellent, number one temple in all the world for the Lord our God. He wasn't kidding. He also brought in about 610 tons of bronze. And the other stones and the marble and all of this was amazing. It took about 7 years, and they used almost 200,000 workers to build this thing. I mean, it was amazing. They had to build the platform for it and all of this. It was just an amazing structure. Up in Phoenicia, they had good relations with the Phoenicians. These folks were noted for their ability in metalworking and all of this, and so they employed a great number of these folks. So the materials alone are well over 16, maybe $17 billion, maybe more than that. And I don't know what the salary scale or the health benefits were, and all that kind of stuff, retirement programs that they gave to the Phoenician workers. But it is likely that we're pushing $20 billion for this temple. It is, in fact, one magnificent structure. Well, when we look at the temple proper of Solomon, we find that there is a basic similarity in on the surface, at least, as far as the floor plan. You have this area, which was the holy place, and you had the basic furniture, much expanded and developed. There was one candlestick in the tabernacle, and you have 10 of them in here in the holy place. But this, of course, was the most significant place of all, where you had a curtain that existed, a thick curtain between the holy place and the most holy place. And of course, the one piece of furniture, as we know, was the Ark of the Covenant, where you have little bowls of manna left from the wilderness that God preserved. The 10 Commandments were placed in there, and only one time a year, on the Day of Atonement, did anyone, and that was the high priest only, who would come in here with the offering from the altar for his own sin and then the sin of the people of Israel. It's well worth noting what happened that day, and if you have your Bibles still open, if you would look over at 2 Chronicles chapter 5, and in 2 Chronicles 5 through 7, you have Ezra's full description of what took place at the dedication of the temple. Verse 1 of chapter 5, "Thus all the work that Solomon performed for the house of the Lord was finished. Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, silver, gold, and all of that. Then Solomon assembled to Jerusalem the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' households to the sons of Israel, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which was in Zion." Remember that when David established Jerusalem as the religious capital, he brought the ark in and put it in a special tent. So it's only a couple hundred yards away, but they go fetch the ark now, and they bring it into the newly built temple. We read in verse 13, at the end of the verse, "He indeed is good, for his loving kindness is everlasting. Then the house of the Lord was filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God." And so at the time of dedication, you remember how that the glory of God in the form of a cloud went with them in the tabernacle. But I want you to activate your imaginations for just a moment, okay? You can do that. I know you can. Imagine you are in Jerusalem that day, and here is the king. He is kneeling on a specially built platform in order to give a prayer. One of the great prayers of the Old Testament was Solomon's prayer at the dedication of the temple. It was well known later on by the people of Israel. And so we read in chapter 7 and verse 1, "Now when Solomon had finished praying," remember, you're standing in the crowd that day watching all of this. fire came down from heaven, consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifice, and the glory of the Lord filled the house. I mean, can you imagine? Here comes this bolt of fire out of heaven, consuming the sacrifice, which, remember, happened numerous times in the Old Testament. It was a picture of God's acceptance of the sacrifice. And the priests could not enter into the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. And all the sons of Israel, that would be you and I if we were there, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshiped and gave praise to the Lord, saying, "Truly He is good. Truly His loving kindness is everlasting." And then the king and all the people offered sacrifice before the Lord. Look at verse 5. And King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. And if you notice verse 7, this is delegated, or this is described as the peace offering. Back in the book of Leviticus, if we had looked at the offerings, the peace offering was simply an offering that an Israelite would bring to God to have fellowship with God. It was kind of like a divine barbecue. I'm not sure what sauce they would use on it, but the point is that they would sacrifice this animal and the sheep, and then they would get the lamb chops and so on, and the idea of table fellowship with God Himself. Well, 120,000 sheep and 22,000 oxen, that's a lot of burgers, and that's a lot of lamb chops. Well, what is this? It's a celebration. These are not sin offerings. They are offerings of, we are now in fellowship with our God. And if you look carefully at this passage, this is the best shape Israel has ever been in and will ever. I hate to break this to you. It is downhill from this point on throughout the rest of the Old Testament. But what a moment in time. What it would have been like to see the fire of God indicating, I am pleased with this, and His glory fills the temple, just as they had heard how God's glory had filled the tabernacle. This is a big deal. This is a big moment in time. Well, I wish we could say that all goes well from here, but not so. Now, we'd take a little time out, if we can, to look at a different matter. When we study the Old Testament, we will periodically ascribe dates to these events. Well, how do we know that? Anyway, well, I want you to take a look at back to 1 Kings for just a moment, and to look at the passage in 1 Kings 6:1. And if you've read this before, you probably weren't particularly impressed by it, because it reads this way. Now it came about, this 1 Kings 6:1. Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So what's so significant about that? Did you get a great blessing by reading that? Well, it's a very important verse, actually. It is one of those cornerstone verses. The chronology of the Old Testament hangs on this verse. Let me show you. In 1 Kings 6:1, we are told that it was in the 4th year of Solomon's reign that he began to build the temple. The 4th year would be about, in our calendar, 966, 967. That's when the temple project began. The text says that this project began 480 years after the Exodus. And so, granted, there's going to be some give and take, of a few months or a year maybe here or there. The point is that when you look at this, the Exodus is 1445 because it's 480 years prior to the building of the temple. And there's one other scripture reference found back in Exodus chapter 12, which tells us this, that the people of Israel were in the land of Egypt for 430 years. So remember when Jacob and the family went down there after he had been deceived by his wonderful children, but because of the famine they went down? Well, the year was about 1875. And from those two key verses, we build off of them because of all the ages of people and that kind of thing. We build off of them, and we can have a fairly accurate chronology of when events occurred, when this person came on the scene. So 1 Kings 6:1, which seems to have just been given incidentally, sort of as an afterthought, becomes one of those very significant verses because it sets in concrete chronology for the Old Testament. So while people pay almost no attention to that verse normally when they read, this happens to be a very significant verse. So now, I've always wondered why Solomon blew it as badly as he did. But even smart people can behave stupidly, and even wise people, when they begin to compromise God's truth, it does become a slippery slope. Now, back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, if you happen to have that nearby, we skipped over in our reading 2 verses there when we were reading about what happens when a king comes to power. But if you notice verse 16, this is of Deuteronomy 17. Moreover, referring to the king who will come, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Since the Lord has said to you, you shall never enter that place again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself. So there are 3 prohibitions for kings. Number 1, they were not to multiply horses. Now, it's not that the Lord has some hatred for horses, but you need to understand that horses were the key to the military in those days. And the idea of multiplying horses is the fact that you are beefing up your military. And it wasn't that God didn't want them to have any military, but He didn't want them to build it up to the place where they depended upon their military. Now, most countries today, including our own, we don't depend upon God to do anything. After all, we do have F-35s and a lot of other things, and the latest technology with our missile systems and so on. So actually, we're cool. We really don't need any help from the outside. That was the problem with Israel as well. They needed to remember that God is going to be their deliverer. God is going to fight for them. And while they could have some horses and chariots and, of course, some spears and swords and that kind of thing, they were not to build it up to the place where they would depend upon it. No multiplication of horses. Secondly, there is to be no multiplication of wives. Now, the reason we will get to in a moment, but the multiplication of wives was not a good idea. And finally, you're not to multiply silver and gold. You know, God is the one who created the material world. He is the one who made silver and gold. God does not have a problem with people being wealthy or not so wealthy. The point is that when one becomes wealthy, there is less of a dependence upon God. Wealth breeds independence. After all, we have the lifestyles of the rich and famous. We don't need God in our lives. And I've had people basically tell me that. Don't need Him. We're cool. We're getting along. We're rocking through life with all of our resources. And so God says, it's not that you can't have money or wealth, but don't have too much of it. It's not good for you. Well, this is going to shock you. Guess what Solomon did? And we're not going to read this, but if you do read this, you'll find that he multiplied horses like crazy, and he got them from Egypt, where God says, don't do that. And so what he's doing is building up this massive military. The second thing that God said was, don't multiply horses. Excuse me, I got it backwards here. But wealth, because it breeds independence. And then don't multiply wives. Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines. These are kind of like half wives. That has got to be the Guinness Book of World Record. 1,000 women. And you may say, this is the world's greatest lover. No, not really. They got their wives not through going on dating sites or going out on dates or that type of thing. They got them basically through trade agreements and covenants that they would make, like non-aggression covenants with it. And what they would do is to help seal the deal. I'll give you one of my daughters as a part of the deal, and you give me one of yours. Well, these are all with foreign kings. And so these foreign women had their own gods, didn't they? And this became the problem. So that when little Susie from Saudi Arabia comes in as part of a deal, she brings her gods with her in her suitcase, sets them up and over a period of time, something terrible began to happen because all of these things were problematic, but it is this that brought about Solomon's downfall. Why? Well, because as the text goes on to explain, these women brought about a terrible change in Solomon's theology. If we had asked him, who is the greatest God? Solomon would have said, the Lord Jehovah, God of Israel is the greatest God. And by the way, there are other gods too. That's idolatry, and that is bad theology. And Solomon built on the hills surrounding Moriah and Zion, he built little chapels, hundreds of these little chapels, at least dozens of them, to these gods for his wives. So Susie from Saudi Arabia wants to have a place, a shrine. And so Solomon builds one. But you know what happened? Solomon began to go and worship with his wives in those shrines. And God said, I can't have the king of Israel doing that. And he said, here's the bad news, Solomon. I'm taking the kingdom away from you. I'm ripping it in half. It's only because of my covenant with David, though, that your descendants will continue on the throne. And so the kingdom is now going to be divided in half. Solomon's last years were not good ones. There is always consequences to decisions we make. Sometimes consequences don't happen the day after we make those decisions, but consequences did in fact come. He violated some very clear commandments in Deuteronomy 17, but it's beyond Deuteronomy 17. Go back to Deuteronomy 7 and multiple passages. He just plain did what God told kings not to do. The result is that there's now going to be a division in the kingdom between of northern 10 tribes, Israel, and the southern 2 tribes of Judah. And again, if it had not been for the Davidic Covenant, David's line would have gone the way of Saul's line, where no kings are now upon the throne. So this is really a sad, sad moment for the nation of Israel. So this division is going to take place, and we have rising to prominence now a guy who is now going to change the course of Old Testament history. His name is Jeroboam the second, or Jeroboam the first, he will be called. Jeroboam the first. He was a servant of Saul, and he attempted somewhere a few months before he becomes prominent, he attempted to assassinate Solomon. He didn't succeed, and he ran off to Egypt for protection. But when Solomon dies, he returns, and he will become the first king of Israel, that is, the northern kingdom. So, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, will be the next king of Judah. Now, going back to our chart again, where we have come now, time-wise, is to 931. The key passage now is 1 Kings chapter 12. And this is a passage that we want to read now, because what happens here is not just the handing off of ruling authority to an individual, but it is what happens in 931 that changes the course of history for the people of Israel, actually both north and south. So, it is the idolatry of Solomon that causes this rip to take place and two kingdoms now to emerge from it. Now, we are entering into, and this is, I think, how we'll finish up our study for today. This is the most difficult part of the Old Testament. And it is a part that most people don't spend any time in. As we mentioned, the first part of the Old Testament is fairly easy. We have a Noah, we have an Abraham and Isaac, and we have a Joshua. But once we get into the divided kingdom period, here's what's happening. Coming out on the stage is going to be 40 kings, all kinds of prophets, all kinds of priests, coming out on center stage and departing and coming and going, and people basically throw up their hands in despair. We're never going to figure this thing out. Well, there are certain things that we can figure out, and we want to put this together. But for starters, we want to just take a basic look at the monarchy period. And some of these things we've already gone over. But the first point is the length. This is a long period of time we're talking about, 457 years. It's the second longest period of Old Testament history. The starting date was when Samuel anointed Saul in 1043. As we've mentioned several times now, that when you count them all up, in the monarchy period, 43 kings rule. Throughout these texts, David is now used as the standard. Kings were like David, or they were not like David. And there were not many that were like David. Most of them were in the not like David category. Now, this is a key bit of a statistic. The number of godly kings in the southern kingdom was about 5, though some might be pushing the edge of being godly, but maybe not. But this is the reason why the southern kingdom of Judah lasted over a century longer. They had 20 kings, and you had some godly kings. The northern kingdom had 20 kings, and guess how many godly kings they had? Can you say 0? They had no godly kings. They were all idolaters. I kind of like what the text says about the last one. It's a guy by the name of Hoshea, who nobody knows about. But what the text says about him is that he was not as evil as the others. I guess that's a compliment. I'm not really sure. But all of them were idolaters. Now, in the United Kingdom period, you do have these incredible moments where you have Jerusalem now becoming the capital. You have God entering into a covenantal agreement with David, guaranteeing his line forever. And by the way, that's what Mary was told by Gabriel when on the night before, or 9 months before Jesus' birth, Gabriel says, "Your son will sit upon the throne of his father David and will rule over the house of Jacob forever." It goes all the way back to 2 Samuel 7 and the Davidic Covenant. So that is a very important covenant, which again reaches into the New Testament. And then, of course, the temple being built. The monarchy period, it will end in 586, started in 1043. But this is the last time that Israel ever had a king on the throne. And since that date, here we are in the 21st century, they still don't have a king, though there have been a few prime ministers in Israel who have viewed themselves sort of like kings, but they're probably the only ones. The northern kingdom came to an end in 721 BC, taken captive by the Assyrians, and then the southern kingdom of Judah, lasting a little over 130 years longer, were taken by the Babylonians. So what we're going to try and do in our next study is to begin to locate the key individuals in the monarchy period, starting with the man Jeroboam I, who plunged the northern kingdom into idolatry. If you want to read ahead, 1 Kings chapter 12 is the place to go.